Okay, Bruchim Abayim, welcome back everybody to Parsha Insights through the prism of the teachings of Rav Moshe Shapiro. And we are going to jump right in because we are up to Parsha Vaeira, which is a portion that's familiar to us from not necessarily from this Torah portion, but from the story that it conveys, is the Exodus story. This is, at least we learn in this week's Torah portion, we learn of the first of the seven plagues, and that whole story about Moshe and speaking with and advocating with and for the Jewish people with Pharaoh. So let's jump right in to our topic this week, which is freedom of speech. So we're going to jump in, and you probably see where this is going. The minute we talk about speech and we're talking about Moshe's leadership, we kind of know what we're talking about. But there's a question that the commentators ask. There's a little bit of an inconsistency in the description. So if we go back to the original calling, if we go back to the moment where God says to Moshe, you are going to lead the people, you are going to be the spokesperson. But Moses said to God, this is back in last week's Torah portion in chapter 4, Moses says to God, please, oh my Lord, I have never been a man of words, either in times past or now that you have spoken to your servant. I am slow of speech and slow of tongue. And I love that there's a little bit, in my eyes at least, there's a little bit of an internal conversation that's taking place. Because look at what Moshe says. Moshe says to God, be Adonai, please God. Lo, what does he say? I am not an ish devarim, a man of devarim, the Hebrew devarim, which we're going to look at a little bit closer later. He's I'm not a man of words. What's the name of the final book of the Torah? Is the book of Devarim. What are the words, the Devarim, that are being described in that final book of the Torah? Those are the Devarim of Moshe. So Moses goes on his journey from being lo ish Devarim anochi, I'm not a man of Devarim, to being specifically a man of Devarim. So Moshe, in his leadership, is also a symbol of growth, is also a symbol of self-development. And so he says, I can't do it. I don't have the ability to speak, to articulate. I'm not a man of words, Moses says to God. Okay? And God's response to it, and God said to him, who gives human speech? Who makes them dumb or deaf, seeing or blind? Is it now not I? Now go, and I will be with you as you speak, and will instruct you what to say. So this is the greatest solution to any problem in life. You complain to God, and what does God say? I'll do it for you. Don't worry about it. You have nothing to worry about. I will take care. I will take care of any problem that you might have. Lo, don't worry. Your Devarim, I'll give you Devarim. Right? And he says, the final verse, it's just blocked on my screen for a moment. Now you go. I'll be with you as you speak, and I'll teach you what to tidaber, what to say, the word dibor, speech. Don't worry. Okay? That's the entirety, that's the concern and the resolution. Moshe says, I don't have speech. God says, you will have speech. Now fast forward a few chapters. Vayedaber Adonai el Moshe lemor, God spoke to Moses saying, go and tell Pharaoh, king of Egypt, to let the Israelites depart from his hand. And Moses says, but God, Pharaoh is not going to listen to me. Hein b'nei Yisrael lo shamu, and children of Israel are not going to will not listen to me. How is Pharaoh going to listen to me? Eich yishma'eni Pharaoh. How is Pharaoh going to listen to me? V'ani aral sefatayim. I am literally, the word aral means uncircumcised. It means with a foreskin. There's something covering my mouth. He's describing it using a different graphic description. He's basically saying, there's something in the way. There's something that gets in the way. I can't communicate, Moshe says. So do you get what just happened? Moses says, God, I can't speak. And God says, don't worry, I'll be with you. I'll provide the words for you, no problem. And then just a few chapters later, Moses says, God, I can't speak. But what happened? Didn't God promise that God would provide speech? What happened to God's promise? Is Moses not believing in God's promise? Was God's promise unfulfilled? And look at how Rav Moshe Shapiro articulates the problem. It seems incongruent. What room is there for this claim after God himself had already promised Moses earlier to be with his mouth? Is it conceivable that it would not be so? Surely God fulfilled his promise. And therefore, if God fulfilled his promise, then what is Moshe complaining about now? If God gave Moshe speech, then how can Moshe just 2 chapters later say, I don't have speech? Okay, everybody clear on the problem that we're going to try to resolve? Okay, good. So to understand and to resolve this problem, we're going to go deep into Kabbalah, into the Zohar. And the Zohar has a very famous phrase in the Zohar, okay? And the Zohar basically articulates the question just as we have. The Zohar is written in Aramaic, like quoting the verses, of course, in Hebrew, but written in Aramaic. And the Zohar, quoting these 2 verses that we just did, it says the question, Ihachi, if so, where are the words that God promised Moshe in the beginning, in the first source? What happened to that? Ela raza ihu. Rather, the secret is Moshe kala. Kala is Aramaic for the Hebrew word kol, voice. Moses is voice. V'dibur dihu mila delay, and speech, which are his words, have begaluta, were in exile. His speech, he had a voice, but his speech was in exile. V'hava ihu atim lafarsha milim, and he was stopped up from explaining his words. And because of that, he said, how is Paro going to listen to me? As long as my words, are exiled with Pharaoh, are exiled by Paro. Right? There's a translation. The underlying concept is that Moses is voice, but speech, which is his word, was in exile. He was closed off from explaining words. He therefore said, how shall Pharaoh hear me when my word is in exile by him?
Why are you using the word, or is the word exile being used? It seems out of context somehow.
So this is what we're going to try to understand. What does it mean to have a word, to have one's words exiled? Right? It doesn't match. You're right in pointing that out. It's a very strange phraseology, but this is specifically the phrasing of the Zohar, is that Moses' words had been exiled. Moses himself had a voice, but his words were exiled. Any thoughts before we jump forward? What that could possibly mean? What's Moshe's concern? Yes, God, you gave me a your and this is how we're gonna. Yeah, the first one, when God said, I'll give you the words, yeah, you got but the ability to express those words, the interpretation, that was what was exiled. Esther.
I'm thinking maybe he didn't have a belief in himself and in God that would put together the ability to get those words out. Because God promised him something, and I don't know if he really had enough faith in that promise.
So there's something that's lacking in Moses. There's something lacking in Moses that doesn't give him the ability to implement God's promise or God's fulfillment. That's a great suggestion. There's something missing here, right? There's something that's incomplete, because otherwise Moses would be able to speak no problem. So
I think I see it as Moshe has the ability to make sounds. He has a voice, but he's under the dominion of Pharaoh. He's suppressed like the Hebrew slaves. So they're not free in some sense to speak. That may be a meaning of exile.
Beautiful. So you're connecting this idea of exile to Moses' own experience, which we have to, and to the experience, the contemporary experience right then. That's a great point, Jeffrey. That is the point, that this exile of speech has to somehow be connected to the exile that the children of Israel are experiencing. And what does it mean to be exiled with Pharaoh or under Pharaoh's rule? Moses' speech and the children of Israel are both exiled under Pharaoh's rule. So let's take a look a little bit more and see what Rav Moshe Shapiro teaches us. The sages coined the novel phrase, exile of speech. It's well known, but not entirely clear, right? Well known, I've never looked at this in this way, or this phrase in this way, but it is a very common or often cited phrase. His speech was exile. All speech is preceded by voice, Rav Moshe Shapiro writes. Speech is its articulation or formulation. When the voice is exercised in a particular fashion, it transforms into words and speech emerges. And what we're doing here is taking a shortcut across linguistics 101 and 201 and 301 and 401 of how voice gets formed into speech and how we communicate with each other. But for the sake of brevity, we're going straight for the highlights, or for the elevator pitch of deep linguistic theory. When the voice is exercised in a particular fashion, it transforms into words and speech emerges. Moshe is the aspect of voice, right? That's what it says. The Zohar says, Moshe Kala. Moshe is voice, but his speech was in exile. He was of sealed lips, closed off from explaining his words. The very words that he was being asked to convey to Pharaoh were in exile by Pharaoh. And then our question, what is the concept of speech in exile? In other words, there's speech theoretically. It exists somewhere, but it's in exile. And as always, exile means enslaved to someone else. In this instance, speech was subjugated to Pharaoh. What does this mean? So we're going to take a step back and look at different times in which voice and speech and sound conveys meaning without being articulated into words. And he notes, going back a little bit, or going forward a little bit, V'amar Pharaoh b'nei Yisrael, as they're leaving and as they're running away. This is right before the song at the sea. And Pharaoh said to the Israelites, Nevuchim hem ba'aretz, they are astray, you're astray in the land. Sagar alehem hamidbar, sending his people after the Israelites to entrap them against the sea. Nevuchim hem ba'aretz. Anyone know this word? Nevuchim? They are astray, but there's another translation, probably a little bit of a better translation for our purposes, for this word, nevuchim.
Does it come from Bechi?
Oh, beautiful. So we will get there. It's related to Bechi, and Rav Moshe Shapiro is going to connect it to Bechi, but which is tears, which is crying, which means crying. But before we get there, so let's go up a level. I mean, not you went right for the deep end. So, but let's keep it up here with the rest of us for a moment. Nevuchim is another phrase which is familiar to us from the title of a very important work,
Moreh Nevuchim of the Rambam.
the Moreh Nevuchim, the guide
of the perplexed.
Guide of the perplexed. So Navoch means perplexed. Nevuchim heim. So the translation here is astray. Nevuchim, they are perplexed, they are confused. So what's the connection? Now that you've taken us to tears, what's the connection? So listen to what Moshe Shapiro writes. The voice alone is a form of expression. It may be emitted as a cry or as a call, but its expression is unstructured. The entire matter is conveyed all at once. I'm going to become very, very juvenile for a moment. And there was I remember that, I think my kids have quoted this, but I even remember it from myself being in grade school. There was something you would say to somebody else. You would say, how quickly can you say the ABCs? And they would say, they would try to start A, B, C, D, F, G. And then you would say, okay, watch, I'm going to say it in 1 second. And then you just go, blah, make a sound. And you're like, that was the whole ABC. It's right there in that one sound. That was one of the juvenile tricks we would play, the mind tricks. That's how you could say the whole ABCs in a fraction of a second. Just blah, just make a second. Who's going to argue that you said all the letters? You just didn't hear it, right? So, but there's something deeper to that. And Rav Moshe Shapiro says a cry or a call is the ability to convey everything in one moment, in one sound. It's, in essence, this is the reaction of true weeping. One who is too emotional to speak bursts forth with uncontrollable sobs. They are also expressions. Don't think that when someone cries, nothing is being conveyed. The opposite, everything is being conveyed with a cry. Our earlier and later masters traced the Hebrew word for weeping, bechi, to navoch, confusion. Baruch shekivant. You got it. One who weeps is confused. He finds himself in a labyrinth, unable to pave a path. Similarly, this is just for your information, the Hebrew word for tear, dim'ah, relates to damua. There's a concept in with tithing, miduma, or the idea of different things or different aspects mixed in. Sight is the sharpest sense. It sees with absolute clarity and distinction. Tears obscure this. They blur vision and bring confusion, and speech loses its capacity of expression. One who truly weeps and sheds real tears walks about perceiving things without sharpness. He loses the ability to speak and to distinguish by sight, and he loses his way. So there's an idea of pure voice or pure cry or pure speech without words, which expresses everything, but is very difficult to interpret, right? The easiest way that we have as humans to communicate is through our words. The most direct way is through tears and crying, but it doesn't always allow another to understand with clarity or to perceive with clarity what's being said and what's being communicated. Esther.
Isn't that the way we start our life as little babies? The only way we convey our feelings is by crying or cooing or
That's a great point. And I think, to further this point, this is also the reason, one of the challenges of early parenting is that you don't know what the baby wants. You know how the baby feels, but you don't know exactly. Wouldn't it be easy if the baby would say, I just need to be burped, or I just have a little gas, or I'm hungry, or I'm cold? Wouldn't it be nice if the baby could just articulate that? But every parent has to guess, has to figure out, has to learn the child well enough, has to learn the circumstances well enough. And sometimes babies just cry because who knows? We'll never find out. So, no person has ever come back to explain what they meant when they were a baby, when they were crying. Oh, you remember that time I was crying? And I think that's a great point, that there is a confusion that's associated. There's a blurring. The message is said with all of its intensity. Everything that needs to be said is said, but it's not understood because it's just voice. There are no words. So let's go back to the cry of joy. The speechless sound is similar to that sound of the speechless voice, just the voice, is similar to the sound of weeping. Whether the voice emerges as a cry or a call, it always expresses what is inexpressible by organized speech. It encompasses all the words that were to be said on the topic. They are all expressed concurrently with a singular cry. Whenever you hear somebody cry out, so the fullness of expression is there, it's just difficult to understand. And this is why, as going back to the Zohar, Hilkach, Gedolat Sa'akami Kulan, for all of the languages and the expressions of prayer, the greatest expression of prayer is Sa'aka. Sa'aka, and by the way, as they point out, and Ze'aka are the same thing. Davar Echadhu says it's the same expression. Se'aka and Ze'aka, the idea of crying out, of just that unarticulated sound emerging. Right? If we were doing a little choose your own adventure class here, we could take a sharp right turn and talk about shofar and talk about the power of the sound of the shofar as an unarticulated voice that cries. We're not going to do that, but Maybe we could pick this up before Rosh Hashanah, and in the month of Elul, we'll remind ourselves, put a pin right here and say, okay, let's come back here because now we have what to talk about why in this season of prayer, in the season of words, in the season of slichot, in the season of the machzor, why is the symbol of that season not a prayer book with all the words in it, but a shofar that has the inability to express any words, but conveys emotion, and an emotion deeper than any words might ever produce. So this applies. So now we're going to come back to not Rosh Hashanah, it's not high holidays, but that was your maybe a preview of a high holiday sermon or something like that. This applies to a cry of joy as well to a cry of as to a cry of grief. Real laughter is the aspect of voice alone. One who laughs loses control over speech. There's nothing to say, as if all speech ascends to the aspect of voice. Great laughter leaves no room for speech. Shir Hama'alot. Beshuv Adonai et Shivat Sion Hayinu Kecholnim. Right? We know this. We say this before Birkat Hamazon on holidays. Az Yimaleh Schok Pinu. What's going to happen when we return to Zion? Our mouths will be filled with laughter. So he points out this language. What does it mean, our mouth? Az yimale schok pinu. Why not? There will be laughter in our mouths, or our mouths will produce laughter. What is this word yimale? It'll be filled. It means that there's no room for anything else. It means that when you can't laugh and talk it. We've all seen this, right? You've all seen somebody who is rolling over in laughter and trying to talk at the same time. You can't do it. You have to calm down, have to control oneself, have to rebalance, recalibrate, and then produce. It's an interesting thought that he's bringing to us. Is it? We've all had this experience. Try to understand somebody who's talking and laughing at the same time. It's not easy. Because laughter, great laughter, leaves no room for speech. I love that thought. I love that idea. Great laughter, because it says everything that needs to be said about the moment. Because every part of that emotional response is being communicated in the laughter. So there's no room left for speech. Great, good, okay. Now let's go back to the concept of exile. If we're all together. So we've talked about voice, we've talked about speech in exile, we've talked about crying, we've talked about tears that blur and confuse, we've talked about laughter and tears of laughter and cries of laughter and all of these different aspects of communication. And what does it mean to be in exile? When a man is in a state of exile and slavery, he's subject to another authority, which does with him as it pleases. As a slave is under the complete control of their master. He cannot express his own will because he is controlled by the will of his master. Likewise, there is a state where his speech is under the control of another force. Instead of expressing what he wishes to express, his own voice, it expresses the opposite. It expresses the will of the one by whom he is exiled, by whom his speech is exiled. He is saying speech in exile is speech that's not controlled by the one who speaks it, but it's speech that is controlled, and its interpretation is controlled by the one who receives it. The aspect of voice is the impetus to speak. The heart fills with substance, but it's yet disorganized. That's the meaning is still within us, and we have a voice. And what happens when you take the meaning of the heart, the substance of the heart, and try to say it, use the voice to bring it forth with words, and one wishes to say something, but doesn't know precisely what, and when speech is in exile, his speech will not express what he truly wants. It's the inability. Speech in exile is the inability to express one's own desires, the inability to express the true feelings of one's heart. There's no control over what one says. What you say is lost. And Rav Moshe Shapiro writes extensively in one of his essays about how speech is exiled in our times. and what it means to have no control over our speech. And he talks about, I mean, it's something, it rings true about what we do, which is walk around and chatter, walk around and talk for the sake of talking. And we lose control over our words and lose control over the meaning because we treat our words not as a true expression of what's happening inside our hearts, but as this commodity that's available to everyone. It's this way of just being and chattering, and it's a remarkable observation. Speech, he says in this point, that we have lost control of speech, and speech is supposed to be about control because it's the one thing we can control. It's the one thing that we are fully in control of in many cases, that one is fully in control of the meaning of one's words. It's the one thing you can't control what somebody else says, but you can control what you say. And that's actually something that's inherent to the nature of speech. As he says, as the verse in Psalm says, Yadber amim tachtenu lumim tachat ragleinu, that God will subject people to us. That's the translation, subjects. And the word for subject is yadber, which is connected to the Hebrew word davar. Davar Torah is in davar Torah, a word, a concept. And he offers, Rashi offers, and what does this word yadber mean? And he offers one interesting suggestion that's connected to the word dever, which is one of the plagues. But he quotes teacher Menachem, who associates it with an expression of leading. Lashon in Hebrew, it's Lashon Hanhaga. That's what the word Yadber, it's Lashon, it's to lead. The concept of dibur, of speech, has to do with leadership. And also in the Talmud, it talks about, there's an idea of when it says davar echad lador, it doesn't mean like we know the Hebrew word davar. Davar, is that a thing? Davar in Hebrew is a thing? No. Davar here means a leader, a dabar. Echad lador, of ein shnei dabarim lador. That Hebrew word means a leader, to control, to lead. The concept of speech is control. One who is in exile is deprived of this power. He is not in control. This is the very essence of exile. He does not lead, he is led. He transforms from one who speaks to one who is spoken, from one who controls to one who is controlled. That's speech in exile.
A tyrant, whether it be Putin or anybody else in history, they want to control speech. They do not want you to protest. They do not want you to have free speech. So it's interesting, the connection here with power and leading. Putin jails people. Iran is killing people that are protesting.
Yeah, that's a great point. That free speech is certainly a cornerstone of a free society. And if you don't have free speech, the free speech and freedom, or the lack of free speech, never goes together with freedom. That's indications number 1, 2, and 3 that there's tyranny or that there's oppression if people don't have free speech. But I think Rav Moshe Shapiro is saying not only in the political realm, but also in the social realm, the interpersonal realm, that we have to be thinking about the control that we have over our speech, and whether speech is in exile, whether we're being heard in the way that we need to, the way that we want to. Is our speech able to convey, is what I am saying to you right now able to convey the feelings in my heart, the substance that's produced inside of me, the emotional substance that then gets turned into voice and voice into speech? Is that getting across? Are you hearing what you want to hear?
But I don't understand something. If Rabbi Moshe Shapiro is saying, he was in exile, deprived of this power, he is not in control. I consider anybody that's living in a democracy, whether you're in Galut or in your Eretz Yisrael, if you have the power to be able to have free speech, then you're not being deprived of it. And he's using the word exile, which in Hebrew would be Galut. And Jews say, you're supposed to strive to be in Israel, but you're not deprived of this power of speech in in North America or in most European countries or in Israel.
Right. So I would ask us to take it out of the political realm, because I don't think the point here is really the politics of free speech.
No, not politics, but the fact that the idea of exile. In
Hmm.
Hebrew, if he wrote this, he'd have to put galut.
Yeah, I'm
Exile.
sorry, I'm not understanding the.
So just because we're in exile, we're living outside of the land of Israel, we are not deprived of free speech.
Mhm. Right, we're not deprived of free speech. The question is, even living in a free society, one's speech can be in exile. One can lack control. Think of people who are in a relationship in which they can't say what they want. They're living in a free society. Think of somebody who is in a
Personal relationship.
it doesn't even have to be a family relationship. It can be a professional relationship. It can be a position of hierarchy within a school or within. There are so many circumstances in life in which what needs to be said or what we want to say, the speech is in exile. The voice might be there, the cry might be there, but the speech is in exile. It can't be heard. Even when it's said, it's not heard in the way that one wants. Or maybe one can't even say it out of fear for retribution. Even though I have the ability, doesn't mean it's going to be heard. Esther?
I was thinking the last statement. A person in a relationship, there's two people, and one of them may be intimidated by the other one to
Yeah.
the point that they don't want to say what they want to say because they don't want to have the other person get very angry or whatever the results are going to be. So
Yeah.
that intimidation is very fearful.
Right. So
Stop talking.
that's exactly right. And we've moved on from talking about, Moshe's physical limitations of speech, which God has addressed. That was taken care of. And now we're talking about something else entirely, which is the ability for one's words to find a home and not be in exile. Yes, Becky.
It's very interesting because the world was created with 10 amarot, with 10 words, Betsem. After that, we got to 10 makot. If we're talking about speech being in exile, what did that lead to? Aseret hadibrot. In other words,
Beautiful.
it took our speech from exile, brought us to Har Sinai, where we were able to get the Eser Makot, where we were able to give articulation to our speech.
I like that a lot. That's a beautiful, beautiful thread. I like that a lot. Thank you. We're going to jump right back. And speaking, thank you for also mentioning the Eser Makot, the 10 plagues, because that's exactly where we are, where we're going now. In Mishnah Torah, in Rambam, in Hilchot Deot, Maimonides says the following, that one should always cultivate silence. The Olam, I'll read in Hebrew a little bit in the original. The Olam yarbe adam bishtika. A person should be abundantly silent. V'lo yidaber ela obedvar chachma. And the only excuse to speak, Maimonides says, is either sharing wisdom or sharing something that is necessary for the physical well-being. Okay, so at which point, I should just say goodbye right now. If we're not sharing wisdom and not sharing, this is a very severe limitation on my ability to communicate anything. I'm taking this very personally, but for all of us, it's a very significant rebuke, I think. Amru al Rav, Talmid Rabbeinu HaKadosh. So they tell about Rav, the disciple of Rabbi Yehuda Anasi, Shalosh Sach Sicha B'Teila Kol Yamav, who never wasted a word. There was no chatter about anything, never talked about the weather, never talked about baseball, never talked about anything. No, none of that stuff. No complaining about the rabbi, nothing, just everything had substance, everything. Zohi Sichat Rov Kol Adam. That's the way most people speak, is the conversation is like wasted conversation. Va'afilu b'tzarchei haguf, and even the physical needs, lo yarbe adam dvarim, don't speak too much, and so on and so forth. So you get the point. And they're going to quote he's going to quote a number of teachings which talk about the concept of silence from Pirkei Avot, lo matzati laguf tov ela shtika. That silence is the best thing for the body, for the physical well-being, for a person. Silence is golden, is amazing, is wonderful. Embrace silence, says our tradition, says Maimonides. Great. And now that we've understood that, let's jump ahead to Passover. And in the Haggadah, where it says, we were slaves to Pharaoh, land of Egypt, and God took us out. We know this story so well. Va'afilu kulanu chachamim, kulanu, even if we're all wise, and even if we're all sages and discerning and elders, we still have to tell the story. V'chol hamarbe l'saper, and even if you told it once, tell it twice. The more you do it, the better it is. V'chol hamarbe l'saper b'yetziat Mitzrayim, harei zeh mishubach. That is praiseworthy. So we had this value of silence, and now we're creating a loophole in this value that a semi can drive right through. I mean, this is the biggest loop. You should be silent, but Passover, silence has no place when it comes to Passover. Talk and talk and talk and talk about the Exodus as much as you possibly can. So what's with this? How do you reconcile this contradiction? We're supposed to get straight to the point, except when it comes to Passover. So there must be something about Passover, uniquely about Passover and about the story of our Torah portion, which is the story of Passover, that has to do with this liberation from silence to speech. In Egypt, Rav Moshe Shapiro wrote, taught, the mouth was unable to speak. It could not express itself. When it was freed, it was enabled to speak its own words. For this reason, although silence is always more praiseworthy, nonetheless, on the night when everyone is obligated to experience the Exodus, it is praiseworthy to speak abundantly. So what he's saying is that the reason why there's a focus on speech with Passover is because speech and Passover are intimately connected.
Freedom.
Because there was something, remember, we started this by saying Moses' experience was as one who could speak, but his speech was in exile. And there's something about the liberation of speech on Passover that we celebrate by speaking.
That's the word of Pesach, Pesach.
Exactly. That's what many quote. I've never seen the original. Many quote the Arizal as saying that the Hebrew word for Passover comes from two Hebrew words, peh, which means mouth, and sach, which means to speak. The mouth that speaks is Pesach, Passover. So the inherent within so he's saying there is something about it. So what is it about it? So there is so just as a dog barks the will of its master, speech in exile only expresses the exile. So understanding what speech was like with Pharaoh, this is just how the sages explain what Moshe said to the Creator. How shall Pharaoh hear me? I am of sealed lips. My speech is in exile by Pharaoh, and consequently, when I tell him what I wish to say, he will only hear his own words. Right? That's a familiar description of tyranny, of those who only hear what they want to hear. That's what it means. I'm going to go to Pharaoh, but my relationship to Pharaoh is such that no matter what I say, he's going to hear what he wants to hear. Just as a prisoner cannot free himself, imprisoned speech cannot free itself. It is distorted in exile. It does not speak its own words, but other matters. So now I hope we're understanding a different aspect of the speech and this question that we had at the beginning of what does it mean to have speech in exile? And we talked about the concept of voice and the concept of speech and the concept of tears and the concept of crying and the depth of emotion that's communicated and the power of words and what it means to be in a relationship such as Moshe and Pharaoh, where no matter what one says, no matter what divine powers of articulation one has, Pharaoh is only going to hear what he wants to hear. That's the tyranny of Pharaoh. That's the experience of having speech in exile. It's a frustrating experience to not be heard. That's what Moshe is saying. Yeah, I can say it. God, you gave me, I had my speech impediment, or you've solved that. You gave me words, but I still don't have the ability to be heard. That's speech in exile. The end of the story is the greatest cry. There's as the verse says, there's going to be that this is the last plague. Toward midnight I will go forth. Every male firstborn in the land of Egypt shall die, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sits on the throne to the firstborn of the slave girl who is behind the millstones. all of the firstborn of the cattle, every firstborn. Vahaita, this is the verse in chapter 11. Vahaita tza'aka gedolah. Remember, we spoke about tza'aka, the most powerful form of prayer, of crying. There will be a great outburst, a loud cry. Bechol eretz Mitzrayim, in the entire land. Asher kamohu lo nihata v'chamohu lo tosif. There's never been, no, it never will be again, that type of tza'aka gedolah, that great cry. What was that great cry? It's the cry of loss. It's the cry of pain. And this vaya, and then later on, once the plague is implemented, vayakom paro laila v'hu b'chol avada v'chol Mitzrayim v'tihit tza'aka gedolah b'Mitzrayim. There was this great cry, and he called Moshe and Aaron at night. And he said, Kumu tsu'u mitochami, get up and leave. So there's an amazing midrash. And we're going to conclude with this midrash. And the amazing midrash starts, the starting point of the midrash, it's a midrash in Tehillim. And the starting point of the midrash is Hallel. It's the part of Tehillim that is Hallel. It's the prayer of praise, of thanksgiving. And the Midrash starts with a question, which is, why did it take humanity so long to compose Hallel? Right? The tradition is that Hallel was written at the time of the Exodus. What took so long? What did Avraham not have a reason to say Hallel? Did Yitzchak? Remember the Akedah? Remember his survival? Remember all the great things, Yaakov? Why didn't they say Hallel? The Midrash says, At Motzai Esrim v'Shisha Dorot. There are 26 generations from the creation of the world until the exodus from Egypt. And nobody said Hallel. Nobody thought to say Hallel. Why not? And in the moment where they left Egypt from the oppression of all of the hard labor that they had to do, that's when they said Hallel. And when did they say it? The time of the plague of the firstborn. What happened? Amad lo Paro, v'halach lo etzel Moshe v'Aaron. So Paro got up and he went to Moses and Aaron balayla at the night, and the verse we just read said that. V'haya dofek Paro al pitzo shel Moshe v'Aaron balayla. And it's an amazing scene that the Midrash is describing. Is poor Paro, who was the most powerful leader. He's now knocking on the door of Moshe and Aaron. He's knocking on their door in the middle of the night, trying to get them up, trying to get it to stop. Amrulo, they said to him, Shoteh balayla anu omdim. You think we're awake at night, you fool? They said to Paro. V'chi ganavim anachnu. Do you think we're thieves? Shenelech balayla, that we're going to leave at night? You think we're going to run out of Egypt at night like thieves in the middle of the night? Is that how we're going to leave after all these years of servitude, of being oppressed by you? You want us to run out in the middle of the night? Baboker anu yotzim. We're going to go out in the morning. Hamtein ad haboker shekach amaranu hakadosh baruch hu. Wait until the morning, because God told us, "Atem lo tetzu ish mipetach beito ad boker." Don't leave until the morning. Amar lahem.
Pesach.
So
They're in the middle of on Pesach.
Exactly. This is Pesach, and we leave at night. But what's going to happen? But they said we're going to wait until the morning. Amar lahem. So Paro said to Moshe and Aaron, Hari meitu kol Mitzrayim, but all of Egypt is dead already. Amrulo umevakesh ata lachalot et hamaka azot mimcha. So they said to him, so do you want the plague to stop? Amor hare atem. So they said, here's how you get the plague to stop. Say hare atem b'nei chorim. You are free. Paro, say to us, say the following. You are free. Hare atem birshutchem. You are in your own dominion. You have control over yourselves. Hare atem avadim shel hakadosh baruch hu. You are now servants not of me, but of God. Hitchil Paro tzaveach. Paro started to yell and scream. Va'omer, and he said, L'sha'avar hayitem avadai. You used to be my slaves. Aval achshav harei atem b'nei chorin. Now you are free. Harei atem b'yeshutchem. You are under your own control. V'harei atem avadav shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. You are servants of God now. Tzrichim atem lahalelo. You have to praise God. Paro says to Moshe, how did Hallel begin? It's an amazing midrash. Paro says to Moshe and Aaron, it's now time for you to praise God. She'atem avadav. All of the praise that I demanded, now you praise God. Shneamar hallelujah, hallelu avdei Hashem. Praise the servants. The servants of God should praise God. That's the verse in Tehillim. So the whole idea of this prayer, of this speech, what happened? This was the first time that Paro actually heard Moshe and Aaron. And what Rav Moshe Shapiro points out is what precedes this is the cry. That it took the greatest cry of all, which the Torah says was never heard before and will never be heard again. The cry of Egypt. It took that release of meaning and emotion in order to allow them to hear the words of Israel, to hear the Israelite speech, and to be able to truly understand. How do we know that Paro heard? And this midrash is a beautiful interpretation. How do we know that Paro heard Moshe and Aaron? How do we know? For everything that they said, he heard what he wanted to hear. How do we know that they heard? Because he repeated after them. They said to him, Paro, how do we know that you're actually listening to us this time? If you're sincere, say the following: you are free, you are free, you are free. And Paro repeats, you are free people, you are under your own dominion, you are now servants of God and not my servants. It's an amazing use of speech to demonstrate freedom. They are free in the moment that Paro hears them and repeats their words back to them as a way of proving, I have heard, I have listened to your speech. And to bring it all back to the beginning, you are no longer in exile, and your speech is no longer in exile by me. I no longer hear what I want to hear. I now have heard the truth. I have heard that you want to be free. I have heard that you will be free, and behold, you are free. And as Rav Shapiro demonstrates, this is the moment in which speech was freed, and this is the moment that we commemorate on Passover by speaking a whole lot. So that's been our journey for the day, which is a lot. I think it's been quite a journey, which is to start off with the basic question, which is, if God promised speech for Moshe, promised to give Moshe words, why is Moses still concerned about being heard by Pharaoh? And the whole concept that I think is very powerfully presented and conveyed, which is the difference between crying and speaking, which is the role of tears and emotion in speech, and which is the frustration when one only has cries and not speech, and one doesn't have the ability to truly communicate. When one's speech is in exile, the oppression that can be, and the freedom of speech the freedom of the speech that we experience, that we read about in our Torah portion, is the ability of Moshe as the leader to finally not only say what he means, but actually be heard and have that meaning communicated and mirrored back to him by Pharaoh. The redemption of his speech, the freeing of his ability to communicate. Any questions, comments, concerns, complaints?
In Daf Yomi, we're finishing Nidarim, which is the whole idea of what you say and how you say it and what you're conveying and what you feel, which is really very much connected to this Parsha.
Yeah, thank you. I was thinking about that, and I'm, one of the things that we struggle about with Nidarim, with vows, that I struggle reading and learning Daf Yomi, is the hierarchy that's built into the relationships that allows one's vows to be annulled by someone who is higher than they are within the family hierarchy. So in a very clear example, a woman's vows can be annulled by her father or her husband, depending on the circumstance, and even her fiance, depending on the circumstance. And that's a very problematic concept, especially as we're talking about words in exile. So we're talking about that idea of speech that's controlled by someone else. So what does it mean to have somebody else can have the ability to tell you that what you just said isn't real and is revoked by an external source? But I appreciate your bringing that up. That's the Maimonides gathers all of the speech-related concepts within the word hafla'ah, which is comes from the word pli'ah, or something that's remarkable. There's something that's miraculous about the nature of speech, and it's us. It stems from a physical place, but there's something. It's the ability of the human being to reach beyond their body and communicate themselves in a very beautiful and powerful and spiritual way. That speech is at the core of who we are. So it's worth exploring more, but for now, at least within the context of our Torah portion, voice and speech in exile and redeemed. Any other, Peter?
Just very quickly, the whole subject of silence was particularly interesting for me, an analogy being in three-dimensional design, the open spaces frame and give meaning to built form. And I suspect there's a clear analogy with silence framing and giving meaning to sound. And we tend always to focus on the letters and the words, and very seldom do we really focus on the silence. And perhaps music is one of the best examples where silence is absolutely critical to the understanding of the music that's being presented. And just a suggestion, perhaps at one point we could look at the inverse of what we're focusing on and have a little bit more of a discussion on silence, open space, the dark rather than the light, etc. I think it would be very interesting. And yeah, go ahead.
I love that thought, and maybe to wrap it up with a Devar Torah, one of the laws of writing a Torah scroll is that each of the letters of the Torah has to be surrounded by blank space.
Exactly.
No two letters can run into each other. And in fact, the empty spaces of if a Torah were written as one continuous word with no empty spaces in between, or if the letters run into each other, it's not a kosher Torah scroll. So you need those blank spaces. They're essential. They're not just there to help bring, to help the meaning or the solid spaces, but they themselves have significant meaning.
And not all the spaces are of the same dimension.
It's true. That is
and
true.
one last quick comment, with all due respect to the wisdom of the elders, the idea that you wouldn't criticize a rabbi in a Jewish congregation is my definition of a nonsense.
I will point out that Peter is a member of the executive committee of Congregation Shar Hashemayim. So your words carry particular meaning.
It means he's open to criticism.
There you go. There you love it. Okay, thank you all so much. Wishing you a Shabbat Shalom, and we'll see everyone, please God, back here next week in good health.
Rabbi, I got a small little question.